Welcome to another video in the Timco Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. Right now, we are working on building out our first section of work, which is the basic register. In this video, we're going to set up our login form in WPF. Now, if you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over to get the latest source code. Either way, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you can be following along. Okay, let's get started. Now here I have open the project we're working on. And just for good form, I don't normally do this on video, I forget to do it. But if we go to sync and just do a fetch to make sure there's no commits out there we have not pulled down. There's not, because I'm working solo. Therefore, I'm the only one making commits. So now we know that we have the latest version of our source code. We can get to work. Let's start by setting the desktop UI project to be a startup project. And now in here, we can start working on, let's start with our shell view and shell view model. If we hit start on this right now, just to see what happens, it should launch up our not going to do that. Instead, what will happen is we'll open up this main form, and then we'll have it immediately go to the login form. And that login form will be right inside of this shell view, kind of like a parent-child relationship. Okay, so that's how I'm going to set it up, which means that this shell view model needs to be set up to handle one or more views. So the next question that comes up is, are we going to have multiple views on this same page at the same time? And I think I want to keep it simple and say, no, I'm just going to have one view, and it's going to be whatever form I want to load. So I'm going to leave it at one view and one view only. And that means I can set up my shell view model to inherit. Let's use the Caliburn micro. So using caliburn.micro, we're going to inherit from conductor of type object. And this is the simplest way of doing it. You could be much more specific in which type of object you want to use, but I'm going to say I don't want to worry about it. I'm just going to say object, so I can put whatever object I want in there. And I just know to put only view model classes in this conductor. So that's just my personal, ease of use kind of thing, I could dial this right down to just certain types, or even create an empty interface and say only those items. But I'm going to leave it at object and be fine with it. Okay, so that's what's going to allow us to display one form on here somewhere, but it doesn't have to take up the entire form. And in fact, what I'm going to do is come down here and let's flip this around so you have a little more screen real estate. WPF does not yet have a great story for layouts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the grid out, Control X. And instead, I'm going to add a dock panel. And a dock panel allows us to dock things in different positions inside of it. So I'm going to create a menu, and I am going to say dock panel.dock. I'm going to dock it to the top. What this will allow us to do is it will allow us to put a menu at the very top that says, okay, these are the things, for example, file. Under file, you can have exit and all the rest. And one of them will be somewhere either on the main menu or under the menu somewhere we'll have login. That way, if you ever wanted to log out, you could. And we can also allow you to then log in again or something to that nature. So let's just create one for now. We'll say menu item, and the header is going to be file. And actually we'll do an underscore in front of the F, which that underscore allows us then to use the Alt key and then hit F, and it'll open the file menu. Now, right now, let's zoom back to 100% since it's tiny and move over. It's still very tiny. The file is very small. If I were to change the font size up here, we could change it for the entire form. Let's just say 18-point font. Notice even with that huge font, it doesn't change anything. The menu, for whatever reason, does not inherit from the window. I'm not a big fan of that, but no worries. What we can do is say font size right in the menu, and let's say 18, and notice that file got significantly larger. Okay, so this is the start of our menu system. And let's just add, one more menu item, and let's just say the header is _account. And then in here, we'll have a menu item for login/logout. So let's say that the menu item is going to have a name. I didn't name the other ones because I have no reason to refer to them directly in code. But for this one, I'll name it. I'm going to call this the login screen. And we'll say that the header for this is going to be login. And we'll change that to be log out, probably. So if you're logged in, it'll say log out. Or if you're not logged out, it'll say log in. That's a possibility, but it does want to play around with that. build out our grid a little bit to lay out our structure for our form. There's not much structure to it. Essentially, it's just this spot right here, which means that unless you want to add something else around it, maybe one of those status bars at the bottom, kind of like what we have down here, we could do that if we wanted to. But I think for now, we'll just leave it at the rest of this form, which means in here, we can add is a content control. And we'll give a name of active item. And let's give it a margin all around. And let's just say that the margin is going to be, let's just start with 5. And that should be good. So now in here, I didn't have to put this grid. I could have just dumped it right. I'm going to get public. And let's go ahead and also create the login view control. So user control, and we'll call this the login view in order to match up with the login view model. So now let's work on this form. Now right now it's gray because it's actually transparent. Let's change that, at least for now, so the background's white. We can take this off later. I usually do this for design time at least. You can do it for runtime as well. The only problem then is if you decide to change your color scheme, maybe you want to change your background to a little bit of a gray, or maybe a little bit of a blue or something like that, where it's subtle, but it actually makes a little bit of a difference in your app. Well, then you have to change on every single form. Whereas if you leave this off, the background is transparent, and then you only change it in your shell view, and you can change it everywhere then. So for design time at least, or for development, we will leave this at white. We may change it later. Now the design height and width is set at 450 and 800. If you remember, if you go back to the shell view, the design height or the height and the width is 450 and 800. So those actually match, which means that we'll actually lose some of our height, because if this is 450 and includes the menu bar, we don't have 450 to give to our login form. But WPF is very flexible. And so we want to actually kind of take that into account when we build our form. We don't want our form to be pixel perfect at only one size. We want it to grow and shrink as necessary. So I'm not going to take the entire space up with my login form, but I want it to look good at roughly this size. Now this is design height and design width because this control will fit to whatever you put it into. So it's actually a little bit shorter, like I said. So we could actually just kind of simulate that with our height. We get 25, maybe a little bit smaller, so 425. And again, this is just simulating, so I have something. Now in this grid, we actually want to set up our rows and columns. So grid dot column definitions, and then also grid.row definitions. So column definitions are the vertical slices we do, we want a couple of those, probably just 2, I think, at least for now. So let's do our column definition, and we'll set it at, I think I'm going to set it at actually star and do 4 columns total. So the columns have width. So this is star. And then, we'll do slash and close it out. I'm going to copy this and paste it a few more times. It's going to cursor in the right spot. And now for these 2, I'm going to say auto. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to center my content so that it's going to take up just whatever space it needs in username and one for the password and the last one for the button. And then the one after that is going to be star. Okay, so that's our row definitions. Now what we can do is come down here and actually start parsing this out. So let's flip this over to our other layout and kind of shrink this up a little bit. And in fact, we can shrink it down pretty good because of the fact that we really want to work with just what's on this center line. So inside here, what we'll do is we'll set up a text block, and this is going to be our header. And so we'll say that it is on grid.row. It's going to first row, so 0. And grid.column, it's going to column 1, the second column. And grid.column span is 2, meaning it's on 2 columns actually. It's on column 1, which is this one, and column 2, which is this one. And the horizontal alignment is going to be center. What that'll allow us to do is center our text. And we're going to say that, let's just say login form. Now notice, if you can see it, it's really tiny and it's right up here at the top. Let's change that. So font size, let's make this 48. That sounds good. And for font family, I'm going to actually go into the properties. It's just easier, I find. And let's go with something light. Yep, that'll work. And let's actually change that font size then to be something a little bit bigger. Not 6 pixels. 64. How about that? Our font size is going to be 18 to match what we have on our shell view. That still looks a little small. Let's actually change this to 24 to see how it looks. I think that's probably better. So let's leave it at 24. And let's also put some padding underneath the login form so we're not right up against each other. So the text block, I'm going to say the margin is going to be 0, 0, 0. And the last one, let's do 20 and see what it looks like. I think that's probably good. That gives us some space between login form and username. If we look at that like so, it's a little bit bigger. I think that's more in line with what we want to see. Okay, so that's our username row. And now we can do is we can give some padding or some margin below each of these. So let's do that. Not 20, I don't think. Let's just do 10. Like so. And let's do the same thing here, where you say 10 below this as well. And now for the next row, let's actually bring it back over here. Now we can say password row. And down here, we can say text block. In fact, you know what we're going to do? We're going to copy and paste this thing. Only a row is row 2, column is column 1, and this is password. So now what we can do is we can actually copy this text box as well and paste it down here and set the row to be 2, column is fine. Not a text box though. And also username, let's need to change the password. But we don't want text box because of the fact that that will display the text right on the screen. So how about password box instead? And that should put stars in that box instead. And we'll make sure it does what we intend it to do. Next, let's create our login button. Login row, let's call that. And say button grid.row equals 3, grid.column equals 1, and grid.column span equals 2. I want to center this button right in the middle. So the horizontal alignment equals center. Let's actually put this to the next row. And we do need to give it a name. Login button. We have the login command if we wanted to, or action or something like that, but login button works at least for now. And then inside here, we'll just say log in. And we should give it some margins too, because this is tiny. Actually, some padding, sorry. Not password box. Padding. Let's give it a padding of, let's look at 5 and 10. Whoops, got those reversed. How about 10 and 5. There we go. Let's actually make this more like 20 to give it a bigger feel here. So now what we have is a very simple login form. Username, password, click the login button. We don't have clear form. We don't have forgot password. We just have login. And I think this is where we're going to stop, not in this video, but as far as designing this form, because I think that this gives us really all we need at this point to do the bare functionality of what this form will do. The form will probably grow over time, and we could probably also style it as well in order to give us a better look. Maybe have an image on the login button and things like that. Maybe even an image at the top here for login form, just to give it a little bit more life to this form instead of a bare, stark form. But to get something working, I think this works. I think that it's enough. I do think that looking at these, I'm thinking I want to make these a little bit bigger. That's one thing that kind of jumps out at me as maybe a little small. Let's try 150. That looks a little better. Notice how it rearranged so it's still centered under login form. Love that. Love the fact that the button is still centered underneath the two. So it really does look nice. All right, and we could actually, let's look at what it looks like at 20 instead of 10. I think that, again, visually breaks it up a little bit and says, okay, these two are together, then you get a space in order to log in. So I like that. I think it's a good first pass at this form. It allows us to get something in and working, and then we can make it pretty if you want, or bring our designer in to make it look nicer. But for now, I think it looks great. So now what we can do is let's actually load this form when the shell view starts. So the first thing you need to do is create a constructor. Now in here, we need to ask for our login form. So we have this login view model. We need to open it at some point. In fact, we need to open it right away. So let's ask for that. So let's create a holder for it. So login view model underscore login VM, and not assign anything to it. Make it private. And then here we'll say login view model login VM. Okay. And then we'll say underscore login VM equals login VM. Now this uses constructor injection. So I'm just saying, you know what, give me a view model. I'm not going to do equals new VM anywhere if I could help it. So I'm saying just give me a login view model and put it in this parameter. When you call the constructor, I'll store it in a private variable. And I'm actually going to activate item. And the view model I'm going to activate is going to be the underscore login VM. Now I could say login VM as well. Either would work because remember, we're just passing around the address to that house's location. We're not actually passing around a copy of the house. So with this versus this, they're the same thing behind the scenes. So let's say activate item, which is going to immediately activate that login on our shell view model. So we use a constructor injection to pass in a new instance of login VM. And then I'm activating it immediately after storing it so I can use it later. If we run this, hopefully it all runs. It does. And immediately I have a login form. So now I can put in my username, test@test.com. And that is not long enough, so we have to make an adjustment there. And then my password is, notice it's not even showing me. It's just typing in those round indicators to indicate that a letter's been typed, but not which one. And then I can hit login, which does nothing at this point. But now we have a login form that opens right away when we load this application. Now, if you're not familiar with the magic that really happened there, it's not magic. What happened was we're doing dependency injection. Dependency injection, once you start using it, once you wire it up, it's awesome. Because I didn't have to say equals new here. I just said, give me. And it did. And the reason it did is because inside the bootstrapper, we have this code for this simple container. And then here under the configure, we said, okay, we want to set up a couple of things. First of all, window manager, and then event aggregator. But then also I did this code right here where I said, give me all the types that are a class that the name ends with view model. Well, shell view model, that's one. Login view model, that's another. So those classes, listed them, and then for each login view model, sorry. So login view model has to have a login view. That's the naming convention. So view model lines up with view and says, okay, that's the view to show. And then what it's connected behind the scenes is the login view model, which, by the way, we have not yet connected. So let's do that now. So let's set this up as a screen, which is using Calibre and Micro. So I did Control Dot and hit Enter. Now, if you've not typed this correctly and you hit Control Dot, you're not going to get the option to add the using statement. You're just going to get the option to create something new. You don't want to do that. Okay, so now let's create a couple of properties. One property is going to be called username and the other password, if I remember right. Let's just check real quick. So our login form has a username, which is username, and the password is password. And actually, I cased those incorrectly. Capital U and capital P. The reason why they should be capital is because I'm actually going to wire these up to properties. So prop full, I hit tab twice. I'll say this is a string, and this is going to be underscore username, which corresponds to username. Okay, and that's our get for username. But our set, we're actually going to need to change. So let's hit enter a couple times here and get this formatted properly. Once we set a value, we also want to do the notify of property change. And do this syntax, which is to indicate that this property has changed its value. So every time we change a username value, it's going to fire off and say, hey, everybody, we changed the username value. And then we're going to do the prop full again, tab twice, string underscore password, give the name password, and do a similar type of thing. We'll say, okay, let's go ahead and do the notify of property change. For the password. Now I'm going to move this private backing field up to underneath the username. I did that poorly. Okay, so now we have our private backing fields up here. We have our public properties for username and password. Now, I don't want to modify these directly, just so you know. I always want to go through the modification process on the actual property because that's what fires off the notify of property change. Also, if I had any mechanism in here to gate what comes in, meaning not allow certain things. For example, maybe I don't want to allow an age to be less than 0. That would be an indication there. So I'd say if age is greater than or equal, or value is greater than or equal to 0, go ahead and apply it. You can't do that on these private backing fields. So I want to make sure that I never actually use these directly. And so I use the underscore syntax, which is pretty common. The underscore syntax says this is a private backing field, meaning its sole purpose is to supply and hold the value for this property. We match the names up and just use a different case and the underscore in front. So that's why I do that type of format in order to better indicate what we're doing here. Now let's create some code for our button, which our button is called what? Login button. Let's actually change the casing on that as well. It's a login button. So let's create a couple things here. First of all, a public bool. And let's actually change it from login button to login. That's better. Log in. That's the action it's doing. That way we can say can log in. And we'll pass in our username and our password. And this again is going to be convention based. So it's saying I'm reliant on username, which matches up with username, and password, which matches up with password. But again, the casing is for parameters, which get the camel casing. So can log in. I'm going to say if username dot length is greater than 0 and password dot length is greater than, let's say, 0. That's fine for now. Return true. Actually, let's set a Boolean here. And set the output here equals true. And return output. Okay, so this is just saying as long as you have a username of length greater than 0 and a password length greater than 0, it's valid. Now, is that good enough? Probably not. We probably want to do a check on this to make sure that the username actually is an email address, and so it has to have an @ symbol and a dots, in there somewhere after the @ symbol. Or maybe even do a more comprehensive email check, which we can do with some built-in .NET controls. And then password, maybe say the password has to be a length of 6 or 8, or whatever our standard password length is. But for now, I think this works, and I'm not overly concerned with it. So can login returns a Boolean. That's going to enable or disable our login button. Public void login takes in a username and password. Again, convention based. So it's going to wire those two up for us behind the scenes. Caliburn Micro is. And now from this, we could do something interesting, or we can just we could do a message. I was going to do just a console write line, which actually does nothing. Okay. But I'm going to put a breakpoint here just to indicate that, yes, we logged in. Let's just start this up and come over here And notice login is grayed out. If I put test for username, nothing happens. If I type T, it should update, but it has not yet. Let's find out why. So let's put a breakpoint on the first line of our can login. Let's start again. And it immediately hits it. And of course, username is blank, password is blank. That's expected. But now if we hit T, username, the value is T, if you notice down here, and password, of course, is blank, which is fine. Let's hit continue. Let's hit T for password. Nothing happens. So that's not notifying us of any change to our password. Let's find out why password is not being updated. So password is our name. And over here we have our name for our password box is password. And it's spelled the same. There's no spelling errors there. So it seems like it would work. So I did a little bit of research and looked around, and I found this article on Stack Overflow. And if you haven't used Stack Overflow before, it's an excellent tool for finding information. Now, this is also a pretty decent definition of how to ask for help. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So for example, first of all, the user actually has a name here, Dave, not just a number. That indicates you actually gave some sort of thought to your profile besides just saying, give me help. Also, there is clear definitions of what's going on, what version of Caliburn Micro they're using. There's tags here, and it's asking very clear question. Does Caliburn.micro support password box? So it's very clear what they're asking for, and because of that, he got not one, but two different great answers. And in fact, if we look here, this answer, even though it's the selected one, the accepted one has 2 upvotes, whereas this one down here has 9. There's a reason for that. This one, I believe, came later. Let's say it's June 4th of 2015, June 26th of 2015. So this one came quite a bit later, but notice here's a much more simplified example. We like simple. And essentially, this is copy and paste with a little bit of modification. So it says, create this class password box helper, and then in your Bootstrapper, run this code. So I think we'll do that and try it out. So I'm going to copy, first of all, this code right here, which we do have to make one modification to. So this is called password box helper. Notice down here in the comments are important. We see that we have to add this particular extra line at the end. So we'll do that in just a minute. So copy this code. It's called password box helper. I'll move this off the screen. And now you have to decide where you put these things. Let's actually create a folder called helpers. And inside here, we'll add a class called password box helper. And then I'll actually paste over everything here and create this layout. And of course, we've got some red squigglies, but it should be we need to add some using statements, and that's all it is. And it looks like the only thing it does is it's yelling at us a little bit because of our conventions, which is okay. It's just saying, hey, we could do this better. And I believe the convention is, it wants to collapse it right into an if statement, which makes sense with a newer version of C#. It didn't make sense earlier. That's okay. Also, our if statements do not have curly braces. I don't want to leave that alone. I do want to change that because my convention is to have the curly braces, and I don't want to have mixed types. So then we have this right here. Looks like reflections, what is needed there. I think we're good now. Let's do a build here just to make sure that it all builds. And it does, which means we've got at least the issues with this solved. And now I need to look at that note a little more closely, which let's zoom in here. There we go. So as Cosmo0 points out, add the following lines to the last line in the password change function. And that is this right here. Okay, so I'm going to copy this line all the way through to this end here. Then copy this line and paste it at the end of password changed. So let's do that. So let's copy this entire line. And what this does is it makes sure that the caret does not go to the beginning every time you type, which is kind of important. All right, so I'm going to move this back over here, and in the password change, paste some code. Now let's copy it on the screen where you can't see it and paste it in here. And it should be that this works. We hit control dot add the using statement for Windows controls, and another one for where that helper is. And we should be good to go. Let's just try it right off the bat and see what happens. First, I'll make sure it builds and runs. That's always helpful. And it's still spinning, trying to load. So this might not be, oh, that's because I have a breakpoint there. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so now if I type test, I type T, nothing happens. So that didn't solve our problem, wasn't magic. Let's do a little debugging. I wonder if the issue is actually it's not coming through here, but it is actually being updated. So what I'm going to do is start this up again. And this time I'm going to put some values in username, move to my password box, but first come over here and put a breakpoint in can login. And just type something, which doesn't register anything. But then if I hit T at the end of test, the password is empty. The username has something in it, but let's look at what password has in it. And notice that password actually has the word test in it. So it is okay. So what if we did this? And I'm just guessing here at this point. I'm just trying to debug on the fly without necessarily going to Google for everything. But what if I just said can log in here for notify a property change? And of course it says no, can't do that because you've actually got a username and password string here. So what if instead I said can log in with username and password? Let's just see if that would work. All right, so there's no breakpoints right now. They're going to interfere. So test and T, EST, it didn't actually run the can login, or it didn't make a difference in our can login. So if I put a breakpoint at output here, come back to my thing and said R, it does trigger it. And the username is test and the password is test R. And so it's going to come down through here and say true. If I hit continue, it still doesn't change this over to be able to be logged in. Let's work through a few more things. This is really what debugging looks like. Now, we can always Google Stack Overflow, and you can always even ask a question on Stack Overflow. But really, what it comes down to is you're just passing the buck. Now, I am not against asking questions on Stack Overflow, but I am against asking questions on Stack Overflow first. Okay? If you've not spent a couple hours trying things, not just confused, trying things. You haven't spent at least a couple hours trying things, you should not be asking questions of somebody else because you haven't put in the effort. And really, this is where the effort of this will pay off later when it comes to the next debugging challenge you come up against. So we don't want to just say, oh, it can't be done. Let's look at other options for this. I believe one of the options we have is instead of doing this, actually, let's just do like so, and we're going to take this off. We're going to cut this out and do a get. I believe we can do it like this and say, let's just change this to be look at our property and this to look at our property. And we'll trigger this just like it would another property. So can log in. I'll do the same thing here. Let's try that out and see what happens. And it says object reference not set to an instance of an object. Returns null. So username is null, password is null. Therefore, the length cannot be greater than 0. Why is that? Because we have not set the initial values for these two things to be anything other than null. Let's do that here. Let's start it again. This time it starts up just fine. And let's just say TEST, password of TEST. Nothing happens. Let's find out why. Let's look at can login, and we'll put a breakpoint at our Boolean here. And now let's just type something in the password box. Nothing is happening. If I type something in the username box, something does happen. Now let's just, out of curiosity's sake, look at what happens. It does not enable this. Let's put our breakpoint back again and type something else. And now let's look at username. The length is greater than 0. Password, the length is 0, which is interesting. I wonder why. Because we had been setting that password just fine. So let's put our breakpoint back at password and make sure that it is, in fact, setting the value for password to something. So let's hit continue. And let's change the value of our password. Add T at the end. And nothing is happening when we set our value here. Notice it also makes this box larger, which is interesting. So why is it no longer triggering this when before it was? And the answer is, I don't know. Let's look at our code. So what has changed here? Well, we changed this right there. That would affect password in some small way. But that's only when the view model is initially created that it sets the value. After that, it sets it here. So we should be good there. And then we also change this to this right here. So let's actually comment this out entirely. And let's, of course, comment out where it's called. And let's just see if we capture the password value change. So I'm going to type something in here. Still not capturing that password value change. Well, that's because they didn't put the breakpoint in the right spot. That would really help. Let's try it again. Still not capturing that password change. Now, if we put the breakpoint on the username, oops, it actually captures the username value, and now it's updated. And the username is SD, and we're good to go. So it does recognize that. In fact, if we type one more letter, let's look at the password field, and it is empty. So there's no value there yet. So that's still not working correctly. Let's take the equals something off. Let's try it again. So we'll type something in our password, and this time it works. So the value is, it's kind of small, but it's down here, it says T. So the issue was that when we initially assigned it a value, that caused a problem, probably with our customized password box helper. So what we can do instead is put our code back that we commented out. And that's why we commented out instead of just deleting it. And now what we can do is just make sure that the length or the username and password are not null. Okay, so I believe we could do this. Put a question mark after username. So it would say it would fail if it's not. And yep, that works. So we type TEST, T, and now we have an enabled button. Okay, so a lot of work to get through to get there, and that was not contrived. I didn't know. I didn't know that the password box would cause that problem. I didn't know how to fix it. And so I want to keep that on video because of the fact that you really have to go through that iteration. Couple of important things to learn out of that debugging experience. First of all, breakpoints are your friend. In fact, we haven't hit this one yet. We need to make sure that was going to work. But the other thing is that when I said, oh, we broke something, I didn't just give up on the code that I've gotten so far. I just said, okay, what broke it? And I thought it was this code down here and changing this over to a property, but it wasn't. Instead, the issue was setting this equal to an empty string. But all in all, what it came down to was just keep poking at it. Now, I'm not positive we're fully working yet. I still need to put a breakpoint here and make sure that we're working. So, test and test the password as well. Now, let's just say, and that works too, by the way, clearing out disables the login button. Let's type in Corey for the password. Hit login, and it goes right to the login screen, but notice the username is test, the password is blank, but the password property is correct. I don't need to pass in now these username and password. I can clear these out because I can just say I'll read the properties. Okay, so if I type Tim in the login name or username, and Corey in the password name, and I hit the login, it goes to the login method. And if I read the username, it's Tim, password is Corey. So it is properly loading all the information. The assumption for how it's going to do it had to change, but the end solution is one that I can definitely live with. Now, I did use this question mark syntax, which I wasn't sure was going to work, but it does. It's one of those things I'm still trying to wrap my brain around all the places I can use this. But essentially, this is a null check. So I'm saying if username is not null, look at the length property and then do this comparison. But the question mark I had was, the question mark, not intentional. The question I had was, okay, but what if this is null? Well, at that point, what it's going to do is say, no, it's null. Therefore, that fails. Okay? So the password initially was null. Actually, so was a username. And so this failed, so it never set it to true. It was only when they both were not null and the lengths were greater than 0 that this passed. Okay? So that was an easier way of doing that than putting a separate if statement in here that wraps this entire thing that says if username equals null or is not equal to null and password is not equal to null, then run this inner if statement. This just makes short work of it. And that was the design behind that character, is that we can use this to say if it's not null, then check the property of it. And you can even go, nested 3 or 4 deep if you had 3 or 4 deep properties to make sure that each step along the way, they're not null. And if they are, then it fails. Okay? Inside an if statement, that failure just means it does not pass the if. Okay? So I think that's it. We now have a working login form that gets us to the point, we don't need this line anymore. It gets us to the point where we at least have the login button firing when a user puts their username and password in the box. Okay? So when we start up with the login form because that's the first thing you want to see, and yet it's not the actual shell view, meaning it's not the first form we see. Therefore, we can close this form and not close our application. Because technically the shell view is our application, and that's where we have our menu and we have the ability to do other things once we're logged in. Okay? So that's enough for this video. That's what we did. We set out to do, which is to create that form and get it wired up to start. We have not wired up the login button itself to do anything yet. That's the next video. So the next video is where we actually have some fun. Not that this wasn't fun, but I love talking to APIs. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to wire up this login button so that it calls out to the API with the username and password and says, is this valid? If it is, it'll come back with the credentials. We'll store the credentials and let the shell view know, hey, we're logged in as Tim Corey. Here's all the information you need to make future calls. Okay? So we'll do all of that in our next video. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.